Hi guys, and welcome to Global Crime Time. As usual, please smash a like on the video, and if you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to press the bell for notifications of when my videos come out. Before we start, I must warn you that this video will contain some strong information on dismemberment and murder, and if you're one with a sensitive nature, you may want to turn this video off now. In this video, I'll be talking about an American murderer and body snatcher. His crimes were committed around his hometown of Plainfield in Wisconsin. In 1957, authorities discovered he had exhumed corpses from local graveyards and fashioned trophies and keepsakes from their bones and skin. He also confessed to killing two women, tavern owner Mary Hogan in 1954 and hardware store owner Bernice Warden in 1957. His antics led to various film characters being influenced by him, most notably such fictional serial killers as Norman Bates from Psycho,
Mrs. Bates.
Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs. We are of course talking about the Butcher of Plainfield, or the Plainfield Ghoul as he became known, but his real name is Ed Gein. Edward Gein was born in LA Cross County in Wisconsin on August 27, 1906, the second of two boys of George Philip Gein and Augusta Wilhelmine Gein. Gein had an elder brother, Henry George Gein. Augusta was religious and had preached to her sons about the immorality of the world, the evil of drinking, and her belief that all women were naturally promiscuous and instruments of the devil. But of course she didn't include herself in this analysis. She made time every afternoon to read to the boys verses from the Bible, usually from the Old Testament and the Book of Revelation, concerning death, murder, and divine retribution. She hated her husband, George, who was an alcoholic that was unable to keep a job. He had worked as a carpenter, a tanner, and an insurance salesman. George also owned a local grocery shop for a few years, but sold the business. The family then left the city to live in isolation on a farm in the town of Plainfield. Augusta took advantage of the farm's isolation by turning away outsiders who could have influenced her sons. Gein left the farm only to attend school. Outside of school, Gein spent most of his time doing chores on the farm. Gein was shy, and classmates and teachers remembered him as having strange mannerisms, such as seemingly random laughter, as if he was laughing at his own jokes. Gein wasn't allowed to bring friends home from school. In fact, he wasn't allowed friends at all, and Augusta punished him whenever he tried to. Gein did fairly well in school, particularly in reading. On April 1st, 1940, Ed Gein's father died of heart failure caused by his alcoholism at age 66. Henry and Ed began doing odd jobs around the town to help cover living expenses. While both worked as handymen, Ed also frequently babysat for neighbours. He enjoyed babysitting, seeming to relate more easily to children than he had to adults. Henry began dating a divorced mother of two and planned to move in with her. He worried about his brother's attachments to their mother and often spoke ill of her around Ed, who responded with shock and hurt. On May 16, 1944, Henry and Ed were burning away marsh vegetation on the property. The fire got out of control, drawing the attention of the local fire department. By the end of the day, the fire having been extinguished and the firefighters gone, Ed reported his brother missing. With lanterns and flashlights, a search party searched for Henry, whose dead body was found laying face down. Apparently he had been dead for some time, and it appeared that the cause of death was heart failure. Gein and his mother were now alone. Augusta had a paralysing stroke shortly after Henry's death, and Gein devoted himself to taking care of her. Sometime in 1945 she had a second stroke and her health deteriorated rapidly. She died on December 29, 1945 at the age of 67. Ed was devastated by her death. He had lost his only friend and one true love. After the death of his mother, Ed became increasingly lonely. He spent much of his spare time reading pulp magazines and anatomy books, particularly those involving cannibals or Nazi atrocities. The rooms he inhabited were full of periodicals about Nazis, South Sea headhunters and shipwrecks. From his readings, Ed learned about the process of shrinking heads, exhuming corpses from graves and the anatomy of the human body. He became obsessed with these weird stories, and he would often recount some of them to the children he babysat. On one occasion, a young boy that he sometimes looked after visited Eddie's farm. He later said that Eddie had showed him human heads that he had kept in his bedroom. Eddie claimed the shriveled heads were from the South Seas, relics from the headhunters. When the young boy told people of his experience, his story was quickly dismissed as a figment of the young boy's imagination. Then somewhat later, the boy was vindicated when two other young men paid a visit to Ed Gein's farm. They too had seen the preserved heads of women, but thought them to be just strange Halloween costumes. Rumours began to circulate, and soon most of the townspeople were gossiping about the strange objects Ed supposedly possessed. However, no one took the stories seriously until Bernice Wooden disappeared years later. In fact, people would often joke with Eddie about having shrunken heads, and Eddie would just smile or make reference to having them in his room. No one thought he was telling the truth, or maybe they just didn't want to believe it was true. Ed also enjoyed reading the local newspapers. His favourite section was the obituaries. Gein held on to the family farm and earned money from the odd jobs. He boarded up rooms used by his mother, including the upstairs, downstairs parlour and living room, leaving them untouched. While the rest of the house became increasingly squalid, these rooms were made pristine. Gein lived in a small room next to the kitchen. On the morning of November 16, 1957, Plainware hardware store owner Bernice Wooden disappeared. A Plainfield resident reported that the hardware store's truck had been driven out from the rear of the building at around 9:30 a.m. The hardware store saw few customers the entire day. This was due to the start of the deer hunting season, and nearly everyone would be out in the sticks hunting. Bernice Wooden's son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Wooden, entered the store around 5 p.m. to find the store's cash register missing and bloodstains on the floor. Frank Wooden told investigators that on the evening before his mother's disappearance, Gein had been in the store and that he was to have returned the next morning for a gallon of antifreeze. A sales slip for a gallon of antifreeze was the last receipt written by Wooden on the morning she disappeared. On the evening of the same day, Gein was arrested at a West Plainfield grocery store, and the county sheriff's department searched the Gein farm. A county sheriff's deputy discovered Wooden's body in a shed on Gein's property, hung upside down by her legs with a crossbar at her ankles and ropes at her wrists. The torso was dressed out like a deer. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle. She had been cut wide open, mutilated and decapitated. Searching the house, authorities found whole human bones and fragments, a wastebasket made of human skin covering several chair seats, skulls on his bedposts, female skulls, some with the top sewn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso skinned from shoulders to waist, leggings made from human leg skin, masks made from the skin of female heads, Mary Hogan's face mask in a paper bag, Mary Hogan's skull in a box, Bernice Wooden's entire head in a sack, Bernice Wooden's heart in a plastic bag in front of Gein's potbelly stove, 9 vulva in a shoebox, a young girl's dress and the vulvas of 2 females judged to have been about 15 years old, a belt made from female human nipples, 4 noses, a pair of lips on a window shade drawstring, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face, and fingernails from female fingers. These were photographed at the State Crime Laboratory and then destroyed. It was from the obituaries that Ed would learn of the recent deaths of local women. Having never enjoyed the company of the opposite sex, he would quench his lust by visiting graves at night. Ed later swore to police that he had never had sexual intercourse with any of the dead women he had exhumed because he said they smelled too bad. He did take a particular pleasure in peeling their skin from their bodies and wearing it. He was curious to know what it was like to have breasts and a vagina, and he often dreamed of being a woman. He was fascinated with women because of the power and hold they had over men. When questioned, Gein told investigators that between 1947 and 1952, he made as many as 40 night visits to 3 graveyards to exhume recently buried bodies while he was in a daze-like state. On about 30 of these visits, he said he came out of the daze while in a cemetery, left the grave in good order, and returned home empty-handed. On the other occasions, he dug up the graves of recently buried middle-aged women he thought resembled his mother, and took the bodies home, where he tanned their skins to make his paraphernalia. Gein admitted to stealing from 9 graves from local cemeteries and led investigators to their locations. Alan Wilimowski of the State Crime Laboratory participated in opening 3 test graves identified by Gein. Gein had robbed the graves soon after the funerals while the graves were not completed. The test graves were exhumed because authorities were uncertain as to whether Gein was capable of single-handedly digging up a grave during a single evening. They were found as Gein described. 2 of the exhumed graves were found empty, although 1 had a crowbar in place of the body. 1 casket was empty, 1 casket Gein had failed to open when he lost his pry bar, and most of the body was gone from the 3rd grave, yet Gein had returned rings and some body parts. Gein's confession was believed to be true, and that he was the only participant. Soon after his mother's death, Gein began to create a woman's suit, so that he could become his mother, to literally crawl into her skin. A 16-year-old youth whose parents were friends of Gein and who had attended ball games and movies with him reported that Gein kept shrunken heads in his house, which Gein had described as relics from the Philippines sent by a cousin who had served on the islands during World War II. Upon investigation by the police, these were deemed to be human facial skins, carefully peeled from corpses and used by Gein as masks. On November 17, 1957, after discovery of Bernice Walden's headless corpse and other gruesome artifacts in Ed's house, police began an extensive search of the remaining parts of the farm and surrounding land. They believed Ed may have been involved in more murders, and that the bodies might be buried on his land, possibly those of Giorgio Reckler, Victor Travis and Ray Burgess, and Mary Hogan. Gein was also considered a suspect in the 1953 disappearance of Evelyn Hartley, a lacrosse babysitter. Gein was visiting a relative a few blocks away from the babysitter's house at the time. However, Gein denied involvement of the disappearance and passed 2 lie detector tests. Police found no trace of Evelyn's remains during a search of Gein's property. In November 1957, authorities announced that Gein had been cleared of any connection with the disappearances of Evelyn. Despite this, some still consider Gein a suspect. While excavations began at the farm, Ed was being interviewed at Watoma County Jailhouse by investigators. Gein at first did not admit to any of the killings. However, after more than a day of silence, he began to tell the horrible story of how he had killed Mrs. Walden and where he acquired the body parts that were found in his house. Gein had difficulty remembering every detail because he claimed he had been in a dazed state at the time leading up to and during the murder. Yet he recalled dragging Walden's body to his Ford truck, taking the cash register from the store and taking them back to his house. He did not, however, remember shooting her in the head with a .22 caliber gun, which autopsy reports later listed as the cause of death. When asked where the other body parts came from that were discovered in the house, he said that he had stolen them from local graves. Ed insisted that he had not killed any of the people whose remains were found in his house, with the exception of Mrs. Walden. However, after days of intense interrogation, he finally admitted to the killing of Mary Hogan. Again, he claimed he was in a dazed state at the time of the murder and he could not exactly remember details of what actually happened. The only memory he had was that he had accidentally shot her. Ed showed no signs of remorse or emotion during the many hours of interrogation. When he talked about the murders and of his grave robbing escapades, he spoke very matter of fact, even cheerful at times. He had no concept of the seriousness of his crimes. On November 21st, 1957, Gein was charged with first-degree murder by the Washara County Court, where he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Found mentally incompetent and thus unfit to stand trial, Gein was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, a maximum security facility in Wisconsin, and later transferred to the Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. In 1968, Gein's doctors determined he was sane enough to stand trial. The trial began on November 14, 1968, lasting 1 week. He was found guilty of first-degree murder by Judge Robert H. Golmer, but because he was found to be legally insane, he spent the rest of his life in a mental hospital. On March 20, 1958, while Gein was in detention, his house was burned to the ground. Arson was suspected. When Gein learned of the incident, he shrugged and said, "Just as well." In 1958, Gein's car, which he had used to haul the bodies of his victims, was sold at a public auction for $760 to Carnival sideshow operator Bunny Gibbons. Gibbons later charged carnival goers 25 cents admission to see it. The story of Ed Gein has left a lasting impression, as evidenced by its numerous appearances in movies, music and literature. Gein's story was adapted into a number of movies, including the 1974 film Deranged, in 2000 the film In the Light of the Moon, and in 2007 Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield, plus the films I mentioned at the start of this video. On July 26, 1984, Gein died of respiratory and heart failure due to cancer in Goodland Hall at the Mendota Mental Health Institute. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery next to his mother. His gravestone was frequently vandalised over the years. Souvenir seekers chipped off pieces of his gravestone before the bulk of it was stolen in the year 2000. The gravestone was recovered in June 2001 near Seattle and is now in a museum in Washara County.